Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm excited to discuss a topic that is not only crucial for the mining industry, but it's also vital for the future of our economies. Tackling transition, carbon transition, and sustainability challenges, and of course the opportunities in the mining sector. My name is Alenka Turnsek, and I'm EY's Global Sustainability Taxes Policy Leader. Today I'll cover the following: sustainability trends in the global mining sector, the global regulatory landscape impacting the mining sector, and the approach to tackling carbon transition and sustainability challenges. Let's start with acknowledging the significant role that the mining sector plays in the economy. The global economy is literally built on the broad shoulders of the industry. And that is before we consider significant projected increase in the demand for critical materials to enable energy transition, technology developments, and other elements. As the industry senior leaders, you will be well familiar with the environmental, social, and governance topics in the industry. So we won't go in detail through those. But I do want to mention the economic aspect. The economic aspects must be considered alongside the ESG components. Because if you want to embed sustainability practices in the business in the long term, the economic outcomes of sustainable mining must be positive. Today, the industry faces several economic challenges. I would just like to mention the pressure on profitability because of increases in taxes and costs. That includes sustainability costs. However, there are also opportunities for growth and innovation, but provided the funding and the supportive regulatory frameworks are put in place at the domestic as well as at international level. I would like to zoom in on the net zero pledge. The members of the International Council for Metals and Mining have committed to achieving net zero in Scope 1 and 2 by 2050. This is a significant contribution to global sustainability imperative. Even more impactful is the undertaking by the ICMM members to start setting targets for reducing Scope 3 GHG emissions, especially as Scope 3 emissions can represent up to 95% of the total emissions of a company. So let's have a look at how the industry is incorporating these sustainability practices in the business. Every year, EY publishes a top 10 risks and opportunities for mining and metals companies. So in late 24, we published them for 2025 calendar year. And listed on the screen are the 10 of the top ones. This was based on an interview with 350 senior executives in the industry. Of those, I will really just focus on 3 that I've highlighted, 1 from the strategic bucket and 2 from the operational bucket. If you really look at them, sustainability is embedded or is influencing every single one of the top 10 risks and opportunities, but each one in a very different way. Looking at a capital, which was allocated or emerged as the top risk by the executives, there are many aspects to allocating capital, but one of them, there's an increasing allocation of capital to new business models which are often sustainability related, and that includes integrating recycling or vertical integration into advanced processing. Miners have voted environmental stewardship into the second place for this year. Let me just highlight two findings about the sustainability stewardship. The first one is the initiative towards nature positivity. So not only decarbonization, but also nature positivity is very high on the agenda of the mining companies. And the second one is around value chain approach. So it's about considering entire mining life cycle, from extraction all the way to reclamation, with the use of technology and data to then monitor and measure the impact. That is also ranking very high on the agenda. And the last priority is climate change. I have to mention that. It's down on the 7th place. But nonetheless, scrutiny around Scope 1, 2, and 3 is growing. You saw the pledge by the ICMM members. Additionally to that, carbon pricing measures. That includes EU carbon border adjustment mechanism and also domestic carbon pricing regimes. These are increasingly putting pressure on eliminating emissions, not just reporting them. And that's Scope 1, 2, and 3. And that's what we'll cover in a minute. So if you look at those priorities, particularly the operational ones, what are we seeing in the markets in terms of sustainability initiatives? Broadly speaking, they fall into 3 buckets. First one is widely adopted sustainability practices. Then we have emerging practices. And then lastly, we had ad hoc sustainability interventions. So Group 1 includes decarbonizations of your company's own activities. You will be well familiar with the examples of those. Energy improvements, renewable energy integration, low-carbon processing technologies, and there are more. Second group includes addressing sustainability requirements in downstream of the value chain. The main reason to look at the downstream value chain activities is to understand the potential of the threat and opportunity to the competitiveness that has been mentioned today and yesterday quite a lot, and how that might threaten the metals and minerals that you're mining. The way that's done is to map mine to market downstream supply chain activity and then identify regulations and taxation that might impact each of those activities in the countries that are relevant to your metals and minerals. For example, carbon border adjustment is one such measure. If you look at Group 3, these are ad hoc interventions in supply chain and in your trade flows that are addressing disruptive geopolitical measures. This one is nearly becoming business as usual. So, for example, export ban for critical materials, and also tax and non-tax incentives could be a disruption. So in the rest of the session, I will really focus on Groups 2 and 3. So let's have a look, how does the global regulatory landscape look like before we look at what does that mean. So when we look at the governments, they tend to focus on 5 different policy areas when it comes to sustainability. For the purpose of today, I will just focus on the climate policy, GHG emission reduction, and also circular economy. And how do they go about implementing it? There are many instruments, but 4 of them are what we see most the governments use at the moment around the world. So either it's a regulation, so they will set the minimum standards, and that will require investments or some operational change. They really like market pricing measures, taxes, charges. That's to remedy pollution or to finance transition. We have more and more incentives, tax and non-tax incentives, subsidies or grants are particularly what companies really like. And then we have transparency reporting. Different governments or even different regions have different preference for what instruments they'll use. Historically, we saw a lot of regulations and we saw a lot of reporting. Now we're seeing more interest into taxes and incentives. The key really is the balance. We haven't seen a country that has heavily focused on one instrument, so for example, just taxes. That doesn't really work. It eats into the growth and hinders any sort of economic activity after a while. It also doesn't work to solely focus on incentives. That can cause deficit domestically, but also causes disruption in international flows. We've seen that too. So the answer is a balance. I would say EU nearly got it right, not quite, but nearly, and because they've incorporated all of the elements. Next, I would like to look at the carbon map. So when you look at the climate policy, what are companies or countries doing at the moment? There are at the moment about 95 different jurisdictions with compliance instruments, and that means national, state, or even sectoral level. And at least there are 15 more countries that have so far indicated an intention to put more carbon pricing regimes in place. Most of activity at the moment is in Asia Pacific, and second one is actually Latin America. In this year, we've seen an increase in global coverage of GHG emission going up to 28, primarily focusing on electricity generation, heavy industry, and increasing transport. But the crux of the matter is in the price. Up to 50% of global emission are priced at $10 per ton of CO2 emitted or less. This is well below the threshold of any international organization recommendations. If we want to meet the Paris Agreement's goals, the price needs to go to $50 to $100 per ton by 2030. That is 5 to 10-fold increase. And this is really what is introducing the financial risk for the companies. So let's look at how the carbon regimes look like and what happens on a day-to-day basis. Emission trading scheme and carbon taxes, those are focused on domestic emissions. Countries that develop their own carbon pricing regime arguably are better placed to achieve net zero and also to promote sustainability practices. Then we have carbon border adjustment mechanisms. These are designed to protect competitiveness in domestic business and also address any sort of leakages. So instruments like EU CBAM, you'll be familiar with that. More countries will adopt CBAM-related or CBAM border carbon adjustment mechanisms. UK is committed, Turkey has committed, Norway has committed, and there are more. Even Brazil has mentioned it. There is connection between the two. The higher the domestic carbon price, the more the need for carbon border adjustment. And also that means the higher importation taxes for the countries that import in those jurisdictions. Energy taxation. This is the oldest indirect carbon pricing regime in the world. It's really widely used, but it's set in a way that favors fossil fuels energy and subsidizes it. There's a big pressure on energy taxation to change that, to favor renewables-derived energy and to tax in full fossil fuel energy. Of course, that is not possible in all jurisdictions immediately, but that's the direction of travel. And the last element is carbon credits. We have compliance regime-related credits, voluntary, and very importantly, Article 6. And these are increasingly a part of the national carbon compliance regimes, and particularly in the global south, in the domestic jurisdictions, they are favored. They actually help involve private sector. That could mean mining. Mining really likes carbon credits, particularly nature-based, because it can offset hard-to-abate emissions, and also it allows other wider private sector players to get involved. So for domestic carbon pricing regimes, there are two key takeaways. And one is all the components need to be considered, not each one separately. And the taxes collected from carbon pricing, which they can be significant, really should find its way back to the industry they have taxed, and that funding needs to be earmarked for decarbonization. This is at least what research shows has been most successful in different jurisdictions around the world. EU got this wrong. So far, they had too many different components not talking to each other and too high pricing. And in this year, in 2025, they had to revise it because they have actually eaten into the competitiveness of their own economies. So let's look at the circular economy. Circular economy measures are increasingly central to national and international sustainability strategies. They are strategic because they reduce dependence on the imports, particularly critical raw materials, and they also have operational benefits. They lower carbon emission and other environmental impacts by minimizing extraction and processing of virgin materials. Specific measures that we see is recovering critical raw materials and carbon-intensive materials such as steel, aluminium, etc. And we particularly see that in electronic products and other end-of-life products, including capital equipment. Then it's about designing products that are easier to take apart and recycle and repair, so not just discard. And capital equipment is one of the big parts in that. And then we have closed-loop systems within the industry, so the critical raw materials and commodities circulate within a given industry. On the face of it, that looks like potential disruption to the mining operation, but actually, we think it offers decarbonization opportunities, but also growth opportunities and diversification opportunities for the mining sector. On the right-hand side, you see the map of various circular economy policies around the world. There are many, and they are implementing really fast. And on the bottom is a list, non-exhaustive list of a state-to-state partnership around critical raw materials. Right, so having said all of that, let's look at what's going on around the world. There's too many countries to cover everyone, so I chose to look at G20 countries. These are large economies. They are really influencing in the region, and they also, most of your operations are somewhat likely to be connected to these countries. Either have your direct operations, or your products are being sold in those jurisdictions. So I've categorized G20 countries in 3 buckets. The countries colored in yellow is where sustainability regulations and taxation has been slowed down and diluted this year. It's still extensive, just a bit slower in implementation or advancing. Then we have the orange-colored countries. That's most of them. These are the countries where the implementation of sustainability regulation and taxes has stayed at pace or has accelerated. Latin America is in that bucket, and Brazil has in fact been the most active countries in the last 6 to 12 months. And then we have the countries in green, which have not really implemented, but they have committed. We only have 1 in that bucket. So why does it matter to understand what these countries are doing? Just bring the rest of the text on the screen. So they have, all of them, implemented all 5 policies: carbon, circular economy, water, biodiversity, and pollution. They are just at different stages. It's important to monitor what they do, either for your direct operation and also for the value chain. And I'll bring all of that together by looking at how one would approach monitoring and then identifying the magnitude of impact on your value chains. So let's bring it all together. So the starting point is to identify activities across the value chain. So starting with the suppliers of the equipment, your own extracting activity, processing activities, transport, manufacturing, and then eventually the sale. So why do we really want to have a look at that? What are we looking for? We're looking for direct cost, what you pay in taxes and the cost you incur in administration. Next, we're looking at indirect cost. So those are costs that your supplier will pass on to you. They also have sustainability-related costs. So normally they're coming through the price. So this is your direct cost in the extraction part. They're all direct. When we look at the supply side, most of them will be indirect costs, but there's a potential for some of those costs to be directly relevant to you as well. Processing. If you own processing, the costs are direct. If you don't, then you will be likely pass on your own sustainability costs onto your processing partners, and they will then incorporate it in the tax base. So ultimately, that means higher cost base for the end customer that potentially might impact on a sale as well. Transportation. It's a really hot topic. In 2027, we have carbon pricing regime coming in for international maritime and international aviation. But we already have a lot of domestic legislation to tax particularly road transportation, but also other forms. Your global chains, your supply chains are global, so those costs matter, and the price from 2027 will increase significantly. So when we look at manufacturing, we suddenly get complexity of, yes, there's taxes on emissions from the manufacturing, but really importantly, we get circular economy considerations that are important. There are laws, particularly in the EU, for required recycled content in certain materials and certain industries, electronics, technology, aluminium, etc. And that is getting more and more common across the countries. What it means is that as a mine or processing facility, you might incur direct costs because you would want to collaborate with manufacturer and perhaps even co-invest. Also, we've seen in the top 10 risk investment in the new business models, particularly recycling. That's where it comes into at the manufacturing stage. The last stage is distribution sales, and what do you do with the product when it becomes waste and it comes to the end of its life. At this stage, what is really important is certifications and labels, because they need to prove that the product has the right design, it has the right composition of the materials, and also that it allows for repairs, not just replacement. It is a lot about supply chain transparency for ESG and also commercial factors. Digital product passporting requirements. That is an EU invention, but is rapidly being copied around the world, with either magnifying any imperfections in the upstream value chain or will reward you for the actions you might have taken. Anti-greenwashing legislation can create financial risk, which is not insubstantial, or actually can help you with the brand premium. So once you have an overview, or I would call it inventory, of regulations and taxation around the world, you know in which country they are coming on stream, and you know which year, you use that to model financial impact. And that gives you a heat map. That heat map is very powerful because you can target investment. You can actually protect your competitiveness on a timely basis, and that will help you mitigate a cost and add value. So lastly, let's just look at incentives. I said you have a heat map of costs and opportunities, but a lot of times you need to fund those. So I want to bring your attention to the availability to incentive. This is not a full list, not all the countries and not full incentives. I just couldn't fit more on a page. But countries really are right now choosing to attract business with incentives in most of the jurisdictions. A lot of incentives today are still about decarbonization, energy efficiency, and innovation. That works for your industry. There are also increasingly more incentives around accessing critical raw materials. In that respect, I want to highlight the US, that only recently introduced incentives, particularly for attracting mining for critical raw materials, but also metallurgical coal. So matching the risk and opportunities is what then gives you the upside in the right time and really helps mitigate the cost. One last point before I wrap up. We had a number of clients ask us to check for their competitors and for peers in which jurisdictions do they have available incentives and in which jurisdictions they have taken or benefit from incentives. That's the public information in most jurisdictions. The reason why they want this information is because they think they're being left behind by their governments. They're not competitive on the international stage. So when they understand what incentives and benefits their competitors can access, That helps them with a dialogue with the domestic government to level the international playing field and makes them more competitive or retains them at that level of competitiveness. We've seen that in Europe this year. EU has issued European Steel and Metal Action Plan, and it sets out a number of coordinated measures to get it right for the mining sector. That includes coordinated carbon taxation and a lot more money being pushed back in industry for decarbonization. Circular economy provisions include recycling and design to help mining industry understand what happens downstream. And there are a lot of state and private funding support for innovation and for sector decarbonization. So with that, there was a lot of content, but hopefully it gives you the flavor of what we see playing out in the global mining sector. So maybe four key points to take away. The first one is around the path to decarbonization is fraught with challenges, but there are innovation opportunities and growth opportunities. There are a lot of incentives available around the world. And particularly, we're starting to see the inclusion of incentives for the access to critical raw materials and even metallurgical coal in the US. Understanding the impact of regulation and taxation across the value chain, not just the extraction and the processing activities, really will help you to protect the competitiveness and really address that financial risk and enhance the return. And then lastly is really about the dialogue with the government, and I understood a bit of what was happening over the last 2 days, so I know that's not easy. But ultimately, coordinated measures, revenue circulation, and that collaboration tends to be the winning formula in a number of sectors, in a number of